Hello, everybody. I am Anarella Calderoni, international tax expert at CIAT, the Center for Inter-American Tax Administrations. And I would like to welcome all of you for joining our event, especially our partners from Leiden University and the University of Curaçao. We have a smaller group, which we did on purpose in order to have more discussion. So I welcome you. If you want to put your camera on, this is going to be more of an interactive discussion. It's all in English. There is no interpretation, so you don't have to worry about that. And you're welcome to raise your hand. There is going to be a discussion session at the end. So please feel free to engage and ask any questions that you may have. So for the most part, we've got Caribbean countries from what I saw on the participation list. Welcome to any other countries as well. We're targeting this event towards the Caribbean, but also, of course, it's for everybody. So thank you for joining. I can pass the words over to Irma from Leiden University.
Thank you so much, Anarella, and thank you to CIAT for organizing this event. We are very happy, together with the University of Curaçao, the University of Leiden, the GLOBTAXGOV team, Frederick A. Müller and Juliana Cubillos, to be able to participate on this event. Our idea today is just to have a short discussion and focus more on the Caribbean and looking at the toolkit that was written by the GLOBTAXGOV team together with the CIAT and with the support of EUROsociAL and the GIZ in Germany. So very happy to be here and thank you everyone for being here. This would be a very informal discussion, but I think that of course we will send the slides afterwards and the toolkit, so you can also have it for you. Thank you everyone.
And Germaine from the University of Curaçao, and Jean Monnet.
Yes, thank you, NRL. Hi, I'm Germaine Request from University of Curaçao. Also, welcome to all our participants, especially from Curaçao, but also the other Caribbean jurisdictions. Thank you for this opportunity. I think it's a wonderful idea to have this webinar, so to share insights about the toolkit that has been developed and in ways to design and implement the GAAR. And I think that's a really important topic for the Caribbean jurisdictions, as Curaçao, like many other jurisdictions in the Caribbean, they are limited in terms of capacity for administration. So it's really wonderful to have this opportunity to see how we can manage the challenges we face today. So thank you. Back to you, Anarel.
Thank you very much. And Frederick or Juliana, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, just also welcome from my side, everyone. And yeah, I'm Frederick Heitmüller. I'm a researcher at the GLOBTAXGOV team and at Leiden University. And together with Juliana and Irma and the CIAT team, I contributed to the toolkit, which we will present more in detail later.
Hello, everyone. I am Juliana Cubillos. I also are part of the GLOBTAXGOV team, and we are really proud of the product that we all with the CIAT also put together for your help, for your also perusal, because this is for you, and we hope that the examples and everything that we're going to share with you today is going to be meaningful for your practice.
Awesome. So let's begin and dive right into the toolkit. Okay, so the toolkit is effectively called Toolkit for the Design and Effective Implementation of Domestic and International General Anti-Abuse Rules. Now that's a mouthful, so let me just say that at least for my presentation and probably for Juliana and Frederick as well, we're going to be shortening that to GAAR. Also, if we say SAR, specific anti-abuse rules, just for letting you know. So this, as mentioned, toolkit was developed in coordination with Leiden University and the Global Tax Governance team. It was thanks to this the support from the German Development Corporation and EUROsociAL. So just to start off, there's been some controversy or hesitation around general anti-abuse rules, both from the domestic tax administration side and also some from the taxpayer side. One of the major concerns is around tax certainty. So some tax administrations could feel that they're not familiar enough with the wording of these provisions to comfortably decide when is the correct situation to apply them, or some taxpayers, for example, may be hesitant over the discretion that's been perceived to be given to the tax administration. So amongst this and other considerations, such as what type of general anti-abuse rule to apply, if it's even necessary, if when there are other special anti-abuse rules in place, or to adopt a domestic GAAR, a treaty GAAR, etc. All these types of considerations are dealt with in the toolkit. So first, I just right off the bat would like to send out our first poll question. We're wondering how many people here in their domestic country have a GAAR. So we can send that question out. Martin, thank you. I wasn't supposed to share those results, but for the most part, everyone here does have a general anti-abuse rule in their domestic law. So that's good to know. We can move on to the next slide. I think, can everybody see it okay? I'm not sure if, is it okay the way it is? Yeah, okay. So then, wait, I just included this slide here to set the stage of the international context for the Caribbean region. By looking at the CIAT BEPS monitoring database, we can see some of the Caribbean countries that are members of CIAT and which BEPS actions they have adopted. So in blue, the little blue bars are the actions that were fully implemented, all of the recommendations of those actions, while in green are the actions which some of the recommendations have been implemented. And we can see in the top graph, for example, that mostly actions 5, 6, 13, 14, and 15 have been implemented, which makes sense because 5, 6, 13, and 14 are BEPS minimum standards. And then in the bottom graph, we can show in blue the number of fully implemented, or sorry, we can show the number of actions being implemented per country. So we can see that Curaçao and the Dominican Republic fully implemented all the recommendations of at least one action. For Curaçao, that was action 15. And for the Dominican Republic, that was action 13. And then other countries such as Belize or Bermuda, Barbados, they implemented 3 actions, while Jamaica implemented 4 actions, etc. So that's just to set the stage, but to get more specific into the topic of our conversation, we can go to the next slide, which is relating to action 6 that proposes some anti-abuse clauses. Here we can see that there was 3 countries that made up that are part of the database which adopted recommendations of action 6. These were Barbados, Belize, and Jamaica. All of them adopted measure 1 of action 6, which is changes to the preamble of tax conventions. This can be viewed as an anti-abuse measure in itself, as it expressly includes the avoidance of double non-taxation as well as double taxation in treaties. Next, we can see that Barbados adopted the principal purpose test, as well as Belize and Jamaica, but Belize and Jamaica also adopted the LOB. So they did they most likely did a combination there between the LOB and the PPT. Lastly, Jamaica went on to adopt many other anti-abuse rules relating to the stopping of abuse from the transfer of dividends, Ps in third jurisdictions, tiebreaker rule for double residence, and a saving clause. So we can move on to the next slide. Now that we've seen that from our poll that there are a few countries here which have introduced general anti-abuse rules, and there are probably some others that are in the process of doing so, we can start to wonder what makes for an effective GAAR. So here we have to see if it's designed, here it's a balancing act. So we're seeing, is it designed in a way that gives them the ability to apply the GAAR in all types of abuse situations, but without creating ambiguity or giving the impression that there's an overreaching power in the tax administration? That seems quite difficult to try and get the perfect wording there. And then you also need to be strategic in the way that you introduce it so that there is not so much resistance to change, and that you encourage its use in a efficient manner. For example, there needs to be supporting elements such as a risk assessment system, because this would allow you to discover when any abuse is taking place and when this could be applied. There's also, the wording should also be reasonable in a way that it maintains tax certainty and a positive relationship between tax administration and taxpayers. Here I'd like to ask our next poll question, which is, taking these factors into consideration, how comfortable do you feel using your domestic GAAR? Or if you don't have one, then I guess you can take a guess at how comfortable you would feel, or just refrain from answering. Who's so comfortable? Anybody else? Nice. All right. Thank you for answering. So in order to try and balance these objectives, the toolkit, one of the things that we can find in the toolkit in figure 4 here is the suggestion to design the GAAR with many factors in mind, including looking at locally developed jurisprudence, good practices seen in other countries, and proposals from international organizations. So next slide. Here, I'd like to just give some examples of the topics that are included in the toolkit. Some design recommendations, such as whether there is an official reference to domestic law within the GAAR, and what this could mean, whether it could restrict applicability, or another consideration is whether the general anti-abuse rule calls for there to be a specific tax benefit, or what type of tests are needed to meet its application. As for the introduction of the GAAR, there could be a choice as to whether to have a public consultation to give the GAAR more legitimacy and adoptance. Similarly, there could be an accompanying memo that could explain the reason why the GAAR has been drafted in a certain way. Also, there's choices such as, will the GAAR be adopted domestically or through a tax treaty? If it's through a tax treaty, then should it be through the MLI or should it be bilaterally? Other considerations can be seen in the next slide that deal with after the design and introduction. So this could be ways of making the GAAR more efficient or sustainable. For example, having the resources in the tax administration for officials to learn this complicated legal instrument, or taking the time to create programs for them to do so. There should be internal procedures that are clear in order to when to apply the GAAR. Some ways to do this could be by providing flow charts or panels that can help decide which cases it applies to, or using jurisprudence if this is available. Externally, it should also be clear to the taxpayer when their schemes could be infringing upon certain rules. And this extra communication could also improve compliance just through risk perception. So given the complexity of the general anti-abuse rules, errors could sometimes occur. So the taxpayer should also have the right to plead their case and access independent dispute resolution procedures. So these are just some of the many considerations that are talked through in the toolkit. Here we have another poll question, which is there poll question number 3? is there a clear procedure set out for the application of GAAR in your country? I'll give you a moment to answer. All right. Anyone else want to answer? Okay, I guess I'll end it there and we can move on to the next slide. This one shows once you've designed the GAAR and implemented it, this figure can be used to help assess what situations to apply it in. So the procedure that we were just talking about. I think this is a pretty easy to understand chart because it's step-by-step questioning can lead you through the process. And our colleagues from Leiden University will be going through this in a bit more detail in the next presentation. And lastly, some further considerations. So just to mention that the general anti-abuse rule is obviously not a magic bullet. There is still some challenges. For example, GAAR could make it so that taxpayers are a little more scared of being targeted, so they could be less inclined to be transparent if they're not certain about their tax structures. Also, some tax administrations may not have fully integrated risk assessment systems, which would make it difficult to detect cases in which the general anti-abuse rule is applicable. In this sense, it could be helpful to implement more cooperative compliance initiatives or international cooperation amongst other countries. Once a risk has been detected, it's necessary to check whether there's a specific anti-abuse rule in place that already covers it. So we should remember that the GAAR is, for the most part, acts as a last resort, and the SAR should be applied first if it's the right situation. Lastly, we should keep in mind that BEPS 2.0 is here, and countries are quickly adopting rules to raise their level of taxation. Things such as the subject to tax rule or income inclusion rule in Pillar 2 could push some companies towards changing their tax structures or getting creative with accounting practices or changing the correct characterization of income if possible. So GAARs will need to keep up in order to keep them relevant and addressing all the different changes in corporate practices. Last slide will be our expectations of the toolkit. So we invite you all to read it. It's meant to complement other international items that are out there, such as those from the UN or the OECD, from other universities, etc. We believe the toolkit is easy to read and objective, and it focuses on developing countries. And we hope it'll help highlight some of the major topics that need to be evaluated by countries and help to identify opportunities for improvement, prioritize needs, and make an action plan. Lastly, we hope that one of the several proposals that are presented in each of the chapters can be adjusted to meet the needs and context of your country. And here to set the stage for the next presentation, I would like to ask the last poll question, which is in the hypothetical case that a GAAR will be introduced, which factor do you consider most relevant for this endeavor? And there's a list of factors. We can send out the poll question. Yeah, there it is. So just to repeat, in the hypothetical case that a GAAR is likely to be introduced, which of these factors could be considered as most relevant for this endeavor? So it could be to identify the full dimension of the existing avoidance risk. So in order to be able to identify all of the risks that exist in the country, whether there's political will to introduce a GAAR, sometimes there's resistance, whether the existing special anti-abuse rules or the judicial doctrines in place are sufficient already, and maybe there doesn't need to be a GAAR, or whether there's political pressure that helps motivate the country towards adopting a GAAR. For example, treaty partners that will not sign with certain countries unless there is a GAAR in place already. So, all right. Thank you very much. I'll end that poll there. And we will be sharing the results during the discussion session. Now I can hand it over to Juliana and Frederick.
Thank you very much, Annarella. Okay, we have the slides. I cannot. For the moment, I cannot see the presentation mode yet.
Can you see it now?
Not in
No.
presentation mode, but
But
You
it's
can see
in-
it, Annarella? Ah, no,
Yeah.
there it is. Yeah, no, there it is.
Okay,
Perfect.
cool. Great.
Okay.
Yeah, it took a second.
Thanks. Yeah. So yeah, good morning again, everyone. So yeah, in the following 20 minutes to a half an hour, we are also going to give our presentation of the toolkit that we have elaborated with our team in collaboration with CIAT. We are not going to make a comprehensive presentation of the entire content of the toolkit, of all the sections, but yeah, the idea is more to give an overview of what we thought when we were elaborating this toolkit. So basically the philosophy and the structure of the kit. And in the second part, Juliana Cubillos, she will give some examples of situations in which the toolkit could be used by policymakers, by tax administrations, or also other interested people. Let's go to the next slide. So first, I will talk a little bit about what is actually a GAAR and why this toolkit. So a general anti-avoidance rule, or sometimes also called general anti-abuse rule, is a rule that in simple terms states that tax avoidance is prohibited, and it serves to allow the tax administration to disallow schemes or transactions that taxpayers have entered into, which appear to comply with the rules of the tax system, but they frustrate the purpose of the law, of what the legislator has intended with the law. So often this means that these are transactions that do not have a lot of economic substance, and that the taxpayer does simply or principally for the purpose of reducing their tax burden. Nowadays, many countries have already developed many specific rules, such as thin capitalization rules or transfer pricing rules that fight against specific tax avoidance strategies. So GAARs and that kind of situation are more of a last resort that the tax administration can use to fight against new tax avoidance schemes where no specific legislation exists yet, or against strategies that are designed to specifically circumvent those specific anti-avoidance rules. It's also worth mentioning that one can differentiate between domestic GAARs, which are part of the country's tax statutes, and treaty GAARs, where the latter have the narrower scope of a double tax treaty. But we still speak of GAARs in their case because they can apply to all the different transactions that can be governed by that tax treaty. In the toolkit, there's a whole section about these differentiations, and also the tricky questions such as whether one can apply a domestic GAAR to a tax treaty and under what conditions this is like that. Let's go to the next slide. So why this toolkit? Well, actually, GAARs, they have been around for a long time. In the case of some countries, there were already GAARs in the tax statutes for many decades, and even before any other specific anti-avoidance rules have been introduced. So, for example, before some countries, for example, had transfer pricing legislations, they were basing themselves on general anti-avoidance rules to fight strategies that otherwise would be governed by the transfer pricing legislation. But we could also observe that practices are very different from country to country. So some countries have GAARs, others not. GAARs sometimes look very different from one country to another country. And there's also anecdotal evidence from countries where the provision exists in the statute, but has never really been used for different reasons. And also tax administrations and taxpayers often mention that the application of these rules is difficult because there are not rules that one can apply mechanically, but that involve a lot of judgment. At that moment, I would like to launch the next poll question, which is, do you feel that your tax administration has the capacity to identify cases of avoidance? I will leave some just a minute so that everybody can reply. And we will talk about the results later in the discussion section. Okay, so now more to the toolkit. So the toolkit is actually a collection of all the different problems that legislators and tax administrations could encounter around the introduction, but also around the application of a GAAR. It's important to mention that our intention was not to create a standard of how these problems should be solved, but rather to give some tools of how to find a solution in a specific country context to these problems. So we included many references to practices of other countries, existing guidelines developed by institutions such as the IMF, the OECD, the UN, or academic articles on the subject, with the general idea that one should carefully compare in each context whether this applies or whether this does not apply, whether actually doing it like one other country that we mentioned in the toolkit would make sense or not, depending on whether the country is actually similar or not, maybe. We have structured the toolkit in 5 main chapters that deal with different stages. And also these stages, depending on the country context, may be more or less relevant. So, like, for example, in the first chapter, deciding on the introduction of a GAAR, we mention different arguments for or against a domestic or a treaty GAAR. This chapter may be a bit less relevant for countries that have already introduced a GAAR in their legislation. However, for those countries, other chapters, such as on the design of the clause, may still be relevant if, for example, they plan to revise the law. So depending on the situation, I would invite you to read the specific chapters that interest you most, rather than from the beginning to the end. Since there are also many cross-references between the chapters, the toolkit can be read in a chronological way. So for example, the second chapter, which is on risk assessment, is kind of a transversal chapter where we make references to at all the different moments of the toolkit where we think this could be relevant. Yeah, let's now go to the next poll question, which is which of the following legal tools exist in your tax system that allow you to identify cases of tax avoidance? So there it's more a question, yeah, is the GAAR the only rule that is available, or yeah, are other rules available? How does it look like? Let's take again 1 minute. All right. Okay, one last point I want to make is that it's important to mention that the toolkit does not contain a general recommendation that every country should introduce a GAAR in the statutes. That rather we make the point that this depends on the context. So we mentioned, for example, that simpler tax systems might not need a GAAR because there are not many ways in which to avoid the statutes. We are aware that, especially in the Caribbean, for example, many countries are relatively small and there are not so many different economic sectors. So many problems might be addressed directly rather than through these general rules. However, we discuss yeah, the different arguments for and against that have been made at the time of introducing GAARs in other countries. And the general philosophy is still that most of the problems that are mentioned in these discussions, such as, for example, a decrease in legal certainty for taxpayers, that these problems can be handled if the clauses are well designed and if the processes around the application of the GAAR are good. Now I'm going to hand over to Juliana, who is going to show some examples of situations in which the toolkit can be used.
Great, thank you, Frederick. So with this picture or this overview in mind, we're going to go to see the next examples. Let me see why this is. Okay, great. So we have first a scenario where we are basically in the first drop that you saw, like whether we want to have as a country a GAAR or not. And for this, we thought of whether, in which case, or what would be the most normal case that a Caribbean country will face itself with this question. And that will be that probably we introduce as a country new domestic rules for exchange of information. And in that process, it is discovered that there is an aggressive tax planning scheme that involves one of the few treaties that the country has signed. This will be kind of like the first alert that the country can get from whether there is a need or not to have a GAAR or not. So we have already kind of like a mile walk in here, which is we already know about the aggressive tax planning scheme. But let me take you a little bit behind this and position yourself in a point where you don't know about this yet, but you're still in the first process of thinking, well, now with the BEPS, point 1, point 2, we have new things, new ideas on new rules to rule the world. Should my country start, and where should it start, to think about avoidance? Because we know also that in Latin America in general, we have more problems of connected with evasion in itself, right? Rather than avoidance. And that is something that we thought in the first section of the toolkit, which we suggest to start with these 3 elements that you see in the graph, which are qualitative description of the schemes. So what is a scheme that could be triggered or seen as an avoidance scheme? The second will be see aggregate indicators that allow me to see whether there are a lot of like investment flows that come from specific countries, namely the countries with which the country in itself has signed double tax treaties or not, or whether the investment comes from different sources that necessarily are not connected to situations of avoidance. And the third position, or the third big cornerstone that we should go to, would be the analysis of the own tax system of the country. This will bring you to the point to say, okay, let's say that my country has not such a developed tax system, but we have disincentives that are really not requiring a lot of substance, or disincentives that are literally privileging only one sector, because probably this sector is the sector that we derive most of our collections from. And these are kind of like indulgent with that sector. And therefore we could have like a stream there of revenues that are not being taxed. All these 3 indicators are described basically in the first section of risk assessment, which is the first, well, one of the first sections in the toolkit. And what we want to highlight in this example, going back to a tax planning aggressive scheme that we already identified, is so we can go and see whether that aggressive tax planning scheme is actually affecting the country, or it's affecting the partner country with which we have signed the treaty. It means basically, it's my country tax base being eroded, yes or not? And we can see this when we reflect on the first item, which is the description of other schemes that have been already identified by other countries. For instance, in the toolkit, we have sections where we signal you to, or like we give you the full address where other countries like Australia, Canada, in different ways have gathered all the systems and show you which are the schemes that they consider abusive and why. So that's already like a share, like amount of information that you can go through while you go to the toolkit and say, okay, this is the scheme that I found. Let's check whether this has been already approved or seen as avoidant by other jurisdictions and why. That also helps you in the quest for defining whether a GAAR can be applied in this situation if you have it already, or whether you want to introduce a new one in order to deal with that situation. I'm going to move to the next example, because in this example, we're going to talk about the other 2 cornerstones that you saw in the previous slide, which are basically the indicators, the aggregated indicators, and reviewing your own tax system. So in this situation, what we have is already the part where we deal with the tax treaty. In this situation, what we're going to talk about is, okay, this tax treaty is being abused, or that is being attacked with the aggressive tax planning scheme, is actually the tax treaty that is most relevant for my country. Why? Because the foreign investment, or most of my foreign investment, is channeled through that treaty, meaning that the investors that invest in my country use this treaty because the treaty is signed with their residence jurisdiction. In that situation, what I think at first is, okay, so this tax aggressive planning comes, or it's enabled by the treaty, and therefore I should see whether that treaty is going to have a GAAR on its own, or I am going to use a GAAR that is domestic, right? With this in mind, we will go to the second feature of the problem, which is, okay, it's my country participating in the MLI, yes or no? And the second, if it's participating in the MLI, is that jurisdiction with which I have the problem signing and pairing its views with mine, meaning it's my treaty actually changing and adopting a GAAR or not, because that can also be the case. So under the situation that we describe here, there is no MLI for us because my country in itself is not going to participate in it. And secondly, or worst for my situation, is that there is no budget associated to renegotiate that treaty. But me, as the person that is studying this case, I already know that we need the GAAR in order to avoid or to kind of like combat this aggressive tax planning scheme. So the question that we thought here is, okay, is it possible to use the information that the toolkit provides you with to promote this modification and find kind of like arguments that allow me to ask my country to redesign this budget and define or derive the resources to create the GAAR or to renegotiate the treaty. We're gonna see, like in the next slide or following ones, how this will play out. First of all, it will tell you, yes, the toolkit brings you ideas. Yes, the toolkit addresses this problem by deriving you two sections that are listed here. So section 2.2 talks about treaty GAARs, right? Where are the opportunities of avoidance in a treaty GAAR? There we discussed items, for instance, like when you have a double tax treaty that provides you with zero taxation for the source country, or with differences that are quite abrupt connecting to what you have domestically. So let's say you have, I don't know, a 25% withholding domestically for certain transactions, that it's reduced in full to a 0% under the treaty, or to like a magnitude that is too big with the treaty. That also is an incentive of the treaty to attract capital that is conducted through these jurisdictions in order to avoid the 25% withholding at source. Also, we talk about like, what are the international guidance that we have? So let's say I have a treaty, I don't have the MLI, and I don't have the budget to renegotiate, but then can I resort or not to the commentaries of the model conventions, UN or OECD, in order to kind of like state the obvious, which is not necessarily the GAAR, but that the treaties are not created to allow for non-double taxation. These are topics that you can see in that section. The next two sections, which are 3.2 and 3.3.2, they deal about the indicators and the risk of a treaty to be vulnerable for these avoidance cases. And what I want to point there is that we talk about aggregated indicators to kind of like give you a hint of where is the information economically being analyzed already by other countries or by other institutions or organizations that can help you out with. Probably what we know as tax lawyers or well immersed in the tax world is that these indicators are really broad. So what we will see there is the statistics about foreign affiliations or the direct investment flows in and out, where is the inbound and outbound flows of the investment. We also see kind of like sometimes the special purpose entity statistics, which are targeted to specific sectors or analyze the data or what is the investment capital that you find in certain sectors. But this information is still being really broad. And what we try to explain to you during that those two sections of the toolkit is that you can rely on this information, but moreover, see it as information that can help you out to build the case, not only because you see that investment is coming really hugely from, I don't know, the treaty that you have with the Netherlands, for instance, or with any country in itself. It means that actually that treaty is being attacked or abused, because basically what the treaty tries to do is to channel, like to avoid the situations of double taxation, right? And maybe it's true that there is an investment coming from there that has substance. So basically deal about this, but do not forget the other cornerstones, meaning how my own tax system deals with these situations with investment, which are the substantive requirements that I ask, what are the possibilities that I have there, and also whether the actions of the taxpayer are really or in action affecting my collections and how I can just collect taxes to this. So with this second part of this same problem, we will think about, okay, let's say that the only situation that I see is this aggressive tax planning that I already identified, but I have other 5 treaties or less treaties. And those treaties are also there, but I am blind about whether those treaties are being abused or not. And the question here is that should I, if I decide to like move myself to ask my administration or ask my ministry or ask my legislator to introduce the GAAR with one of the treaties, what would I do with the rest ones, with the other ones? Because normally what we see in general terms is that if the taxpayer is channeling investment to one country and that double tax treaty gets kind of like a measure that makes them know that aggressive tax planning is not going to come from this side, they try to find another way to actually channel the same structure, right? And therefore it's important to see whether the other treaties that I have as a country are also vulnerable to tax treaty practices, yes or not. To this, we have put directly, once again, we drive you to please go and see whether these countries have already kind of like information about aggressive or not necessarily aggressive, but at least avoidant practices, right? The second thing that we will do is to drive you to this flow chart, right? So in this figure, well, okay, good. You can see the first, like it's very easy to go through it and find whether my treaty, it's actually, it has a GAAR or not, or if it is covered by the MLI, which will be the first question. It means that if my treaty is being abused, then what I can do, I will resort to the general anti-avoidance ruling, right, rule. And that will be okay. Let's say that no, I don't have that opportunity because once again, my country is not in the MLI and the treaty was negotiated really, really far away, like in the 2000, and it has no GAAR on its own. So I will go and then try to see whether actually the treaty is being abused or not. And there you have like the second question where you can go back and see the aggregated indicators. You can go back and see the description of schemes of avoidance in other countries. And let's say that you find that, yes, there is doubt or there is like a huge inflow from capital there. And it's also kind of like really connected with holding companies or something that it's like just a start of a hint of an abuse. You say, okay, yes, that's happening. Then you go to the country and see whether you can apply your own domestic GAAR to those problems or not. This is important because sometimes, not always, you can apply your GAAR to the treaty because that will be a breach of a treaty or not. So if you resolve this, you can have two ways here. The first one will be no, I cannot do this because I will be in breach of the treaty. What you should do then, you will start like a long list of asking yourself whether you can resort to the commentaries in the models and why and in which way, if they allow you to stop or like disallow the benefits of the treaty to that scheme. And there we have like a long list or 4 other questions where you can find or you can use to see whether the renegotiation is actually present or needed or not, right? If you can still use your domestic GAAR, then you will go down on the line which says yes, and you will do like a next assessment, which is does my treaty contain a clause in the protocol that specifically allows me to use this GAAR, this domestic GAAR? Because that's also another point. Sometimes the protocol gives you also input. Not necessarily that is a clause within the treaty, but you have in the protocol arranged something that, well, this also covers this, or maybe it's reminded that the treaty is not being used for double non-taxation, for instance, which also sometimes happens to be there. So that's also an important thing to highlight. Okay, here for the third situation, I want to launch the next poll question before we go into it, which is, which of the following administrative elements you consider most useful to identify tax avoidance cases? You have many options. So the risk assessment to detect the avoidance, which is basically what we have commented in the last 2 examples in extent, or communication mechanisms with taxpayers. Sometimes you get hints on what is happening with the investment and everything from the own structures that they disclose to the tax administration. Or you have also information from tax returns, which you channel through your own tax administration system. Or the last one is the possibility to have an expert committee that help you or assist you to see whether a situation is part of the tax avoidance scheme or not. Correct. Is anyone else willing to participate? Okay, we're gonna go on. So this question is launched here because we're gonna move into a terrain where we already have no doubt, which is, okay, we know there is an internal procedure to go along with the GAAR. Let's say that I already identify whether the GAAR that I'm going to use is the local one, the domestic one, which exists in the law, or I am going to use the treaty one, which exists due to the MLI, due to the fact that I already arranged one, that I renegotiate a treaty, or I can use the one that is mentioned in the commentary of the models, anything of this. We need to know that the GAAR in itself, although it's a rule, it is also a procedure behind it. Why we say this is a procedure? Because it doesn't suffice with the fact that we have the norm in our system, or we have a norm that allows us to find or attack avoidance situations. Clearly, for those that have one of these norms already implemented, you know that sometimes it's kind of like a really not defined terrain, especially for law, to know exactly how to apply it, right? And there's where this example comes into play. So let's say that we have the GAAR, and then when we're going to apply it, we have different dependencies within the tax administration. And then these dependencies have not a clear cut on how the process goes, because the legislation just enacted it, but we don't have an administrative procedure that we share together to know how to apply it, meaning that we don't know exactly which of the dependencies within the tax administration can apply it or not. Or we know in general terms that this is a last resort that we can choose from or use, and maybe there is no committee for studying whether the case that I consider it's an avoidance case should be used with the GAAR or not. So in here, we try to provide you with a flow chart that we're going to see in a minute, where you can see exactly how, in theory, a GAAR or generally GAARs should be working out, right? And then we have also the general guidelines and explanations about GAARs, right? Which are connected with how to bring the GAAR and not disrupt the confidence that taxpayers have on the system. Because literally, like saying again or stating it again, the GAAR is not necessarily defined completely. And that situation brings necessarily uncertainty for the taxpayers at the beginning. But the more clear we as tax administration and as legal system, we explain this to the taxpayers, the better it will be for them and for the tax administration to work with the norm. So we go to the next slide, where we have the flow chart. So this is half of the flow chart that is within the toolkit. What we're going to see here is that basically the first thing that anyone does to apply a GAAR will be to take everything that we have talked about, the reports, the disclosure information, which is also something that with Action 12 of the BEPS reports, it's already mostly implemented, or generic hallmarks of what is avoidant for my situation or for the time being. And then move from there to see whether I have a more specific norm that could be applied. Let's say that I don't need to deal with the full procedure of GAARs if my problem or the situation that the taxpayer is committing is just something that has to do with dividends. And maybe I see within the documentation that the participation that this person had on the other company does not allow them to use this benefit. So in that case, what we should think if we are doing the assessment ourselves will be, okay, I don't need the SAR, I don't need the GAAR, I will use the SAR, which is the specific anti-avoidance. But if we go along and we say, okay, no, this is not the case is that they comply with everything in the law. They have done everything, they have the participation, they have everything, but they are still going against the purpose of this rule, because they have conducted, I don't know, like several payments through many entities for a transaction that normally will not be performed this way. So we go to the next point, where is, okay, we're going to apply the GAAR. And this application will lead you to first assess the little items that are within the wording of the GAAR. If you have been faced with the challenge of using a GAAR, you will always know that it's difficult to see exactly what to pinpoint at the beginning. So you go first to the tax benefit. So did this taxpayer got a benefit? And then you say, okay, that's the unfair thing. And then you go to see the threshold, if there's a threshold, because normally when countries implement a GAAR, they decide this to be applied only to huge cases, so cases that have like an amount that is substantial, because this also takes time and effort from the like administrative costs need to be reduced. But with this two, you are forgetting to see whether the scheme is complete. The first thing that we recommend or should be done here is to see all the scheme. Where does the payment start? Who provides which service? And design the full structure, right? So when the structure is done, you see what is the tax benefit. And from then on, you see whether the benefit falls within the threshold or not. And the last thing in this is, okay, is the structure not logic or it doesn't fit economic purposes? Meaning that basically the most important thing here was a tax benefit. And only in that point where you have this certainty or you have like huge reasons to believe that definitely this is an avoidance case, you will issue the notice to the taxpayer to tell them, hey, I saw your structure and this is the point where I am applying to you the GAAR, right? Keeping this into kind of like one corner of your mental picture. So you have your mental picture, right? With the scheme. And then when that's complete, you move along the other steps, right? So see the tax benefit, see if that benefit is within the threshold. If there is no threshold, then that tax benefit is still within the scope of the GAAR. And then you go to the principal purpose. The principal purpose is kind of like the most foggy part of them all. And we have devoted like extensive time there in the toolkit for you to see, what does this mean? Like, what is the principal purpose? And we try not to exhaust what that could be, but moreover to tell you that there are objective and subjective tests that you need to follow. What this is in simple terms, you go with the GAAR to see whether your taxpayer is behaving in a way that is conclusive to their economic interest. So if I am, I don't know, if I am a ship, right, the owner of a ship, and my ship needs to go from, I don't know, from Curacao to Argentina. And then they have this thing. But instead of going directly, although economically will make sense, this ship goes on the other port of Japan to go back to Argentina, right? And that's something that never happens. Let's say that you know really well how this ship industry works, and that's something that never happens because economically speaking would not make sense. That situation would give you already an index, like kind of like a hint of a principal purpose test that maybe some scheme that has been created that is away from the economic normal things that someone will do, right? And with this and with other elements of circumstances of like a proof or like the information that you got from tax returns and everything else, if you can support that it has no reason to be like that, then you can go ahead and issue the notice to the taxpayer and say, okay, I did my whole study and I see that you have this scheme and you're not doing things that will be economically sound. So my guess in this situation is that you did it only for the tax benefit. And that point is basically when you will move to the next one, which is the GAAR analysis, where you have already the taxpayer, because he's involved here in the last, you issue the notification and the taxpayers come to play. How do they play with you? Well, they come and respond and they tell you, no, wait, like, don't assume things so fast. I went to Japan because this and this and this, or whatever, to fix something, right? And then they explain you, but they need to provide you the proof. All that proof is something that normally the tax administration does not get in the first time in the beginning, because the tax return is really specific, because the financial records, they show you the general overview at the end of the year. And there is where the GAAR is kind of like not necessarily a clause that will be just give you what the SAR gives you, which is directly you apply or you don't, but moreover, a space where you actually go to the taxpayer and involve them in the process. And that's something that is also kind of like lost. And that's why people are like, oh yeah, but this is uncertainty. Well, not necessarily. This is talking to each other, right? And the last thing of this part, or how this should play out, is, okay, this new information allows me to say, okay, I understand now, and you deserve the tax benefit, or you don't, because maybe what they bring out, it's not really creating or filling the gap of why did you do this when commercially it's not sound, right? So this is kind of like the last part of this example. Obviously, we are gonna, we have a poll question that I am missing, which is question 8. Am I again away? Okay, good, thank you. So this question is more to be used in the comment section. Which one of the following elements will you consider best to address taxpayers' concern regarding the introduction of a GAAR? This question is now put to you because we are in the last part where we noticed that the GAAR definitely has to involve taxpayers. And we need to involve them in a way to allow them to keep on being interested in investing in the country, for one point, which every country wants, but also because they need to know exactly how this works. And we are like gonna give a better overview that we know what we are doing with the GAAR if we embark them in the process. And we tell them exactly, okay, I'm doing this, and